At its core, Operation Economic Outcast represents a public relations maneuver designed to repackage a strategic stalemate as an endgame. With domestic public opinion increasingly recognizing that military interventions have yielded economic instability rather than security, the regime requires a narrative of decisive action. By framing financial restrictions in the sweeping language of wartime mobilization, the White House attempts to project control. However, replacing missile strikes with secondary financial boycotts does not erase 6 months of stalled objectives and reduced munitions. As global economic friction mounts and the Strait of Hormuz remains contested, maximum financial pressure may simply deepen the deadlock, leaving the US entangled in a multi-front, multinational conflict with no clear exit strategy.
大家好，这里是嘎人四绝频道。刚才这段精彩集锦，算是把华盛顿这场所谓经济孤立行动的包装术拆得相当彻底。导弹没有换来胜利，军事目标迟迟无法实现，于是白宫把金融制裁重新涂上一层最后一击的颜色，甚至拿诺曼底登陆来做比喻。这样的宣传口号听起来声势浩大，却掩盖不了一个尴尬事实：伊朗没有垮台，美国也没有逼近核计划和政权目标，反而让能源市场、全球供应链和地区安全陷入更大震荡。更有意思的是，美国一边宣称局势尽在掌控，一边不断向盟友、对手和第三国发出最后通牒，仿佛只要把话说得够狠，现实就会自动让路。但金融霸凌能否换来战略成果，显然是另一回事。接下来正片将继续追踪这场制裁攻势背后的政治算盘，以及它如何把美国拖入一场多线并发却没有明确退路的危机。
Nearly 6 months into a failed war with Iran, the White House is rolling out a new grand strategy. Billed as an unprecedented financial assault, the Treasury Department has launched Operation Economic Outcast, a sweeping branding campaign designed to sever every remaining financial artery connecting Tehran to the outside world. Unveiling the offensive, economically illiterate US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent framed the measures as an economic equivalent of the Normandy landings, stating that at Donald Trump's direction, the United States Treasury has begun Operation Economic Outcast. Bessent described it as an unprecedented campaign against Iran and its enablers. He declared, "We are launching an economic onslaught against Iran's financial connections around the globe. Our objective is to sever every economic lifeline that sustains this tyrannical regime until Tehran stands alone." I'm not sure who gets to decide who is the tyrannical regime these days.
We want to make clear here today that no one is above the reach of U.S. sanctions, that if they facilitate transactions and are part of the ecosystem that turns Iranian oil into money, into repression, they will be targeted. We find that the best way to engage with countries is through quiet diplomacy, and we are level setting with every country to tell them our expectations. We know who they are, they know who they are, so when the hammer of U.S. Treasury actions falls upon them, they will have no one to blame but themselves.
Behind the martial rhetoric lies an undeniable political reality. Washington is shifting the goalposts. Having spent months declaring that Iran's military apparatus was mostly destroyed, the Trump regime's sudden pivot to financial warfare reveals a desperate strategy aimed at managing public opinion, which increasingly recognizes that the US is failing to achieve its military objectives in the Middle East, and the midterms are just around the corner. The domestic fallout of this prolonged conflict is reflected in recent public opinion data. A new Reuters Ipsos poll shows that public approval for the war with Iran has dropped to its lowest level since the conflict's early days at the end of February. Now, only 31% of Americans surveyed support military action in Iran, down from 34% earlier this month. Notably, fewer Americans who identify as Republicans support the war. According to the poll, that number now sits at 69%, compared to 77% in March. This comes at a time when Donald Trump's own approval ratings hover at a new low of 33%, according to recent polling. The introduction of Operation Economic Outcast creates a glaring paradox within official White House messaging. For months, Donald Trump and military officials insisted that initial joint US-Israeli strikes had crushed the regime's capabilities, leaving it mostly destroyed. Public assurances repeatedly suggesting that Tehran was on the verge of total collapse, unable to pay its forces or maintain basic governance. If the Iranian state and military apparatus were indeed shattered, the sudden requirement for an emergency D-Day-style economic crusade becomes difficult to justify. The necessity of launching a global financial dragnet, threatening allies and adversaries alike, proves that previous claims of victory were wildly premature. Rather than operating from a position of strength to deliver a final blow, Washington is resorting to secondary sanctions because kinetic military power has failed to force Tehran's capitulation.
I am confident the president, as you all know, is quite persuasive, and we are following his calls up with calls from visits and calls from the State Department and from the U.S. Treasury, expecting them, or telling the leaders, the countries, and the entities exactly what we expect and the timelines. And I would expect that very quickly, if they do not respond, then you will see the ramifications of their actions.
Far from collapsing, the government in Tehran responded to initial Western strikes by consolidating power and escalating the conflict. Hardline elements solidified their grip on the state, subsequently declaring the closure of the strategic Strait of Hormuz and targeting commercial vessels navigating the waterway. The resulting U.S. counter-blockade on Iranian petroleum exports triggered a severe maritime impasse, sending shockwaves through global energy markets and supply chains, resulting in Donald Trump claiming that the Strait of Hormuz, under his leadership, was now U.S. territory. As foreign policy experts observe, the military campaign has yielded neither a decisive strategic victory nor a diplomatic breakthrough. Andrew Miller, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, noted that the sanctions unveil what has become obvious to observers. This war has brought the United States no closer to eliminating Iran's nuclear program or crippling the Iranian regime. Miller emphasized that while economic pressure carries weight, it remains highly unlikely to produce a rapid settlement on terms favorable to the United States.
Every country, every entity should know that they should be prepared to face U.S. sanctions. And no one is above this. We are going to hold everyone accountable, and this is economic asphyxiation of this regime. And Jennifer, as I said, no one should test our resolve.
The ridiculously branded Operation Economic Outcast seeks to enforce a zero-leakage regime, targeting vital third-country financial lifelines, including shipping, digital assets, technology, gold, and aviation. Under the explicit threat of being cut off from the US dollar system, international entities and sovereign states are being given ultimatum deadlines to cut ties with Tehran. This aggressive unilateralism faces formidable structural hurdles. China remains Iran's largest trading partner, absorbing an estimated 80% of its exported crude oil over the past year. When pressed on whether Chinese financial institutions would face primary targeting, Treasury officials asserted that no one is above the reach of US sanctions. In response, Beijing's diplomatic representatives maintained that coercion and sanctions cannot resolve the crisis, urging political and diplomatic negotiations instead. They recognize that Trump's branding exercise could make things much, much worse. While regional partners like the United Arab Emirates moved to suspend trade transactions with Iran, key regional players such as Turkey have resisted immediate compliance. Tehran has made it clear it will not submit quietly. Major General Ali Abdul-Ahi, Chief of Staff of Iran's armed forces, warned that Tehran is preparing symmetrical and asymmetrical counter-responses spanning air, sea, land and cyber operations. Meanwhile, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth explicitly confirmed that kinetic strikes around the Strait of Hormuz and within Iranian territory remain under active consideration. At its core, Operation Economic Outcast represents a public relations maneuver designed to repackage a strategic stalemate as an endgame. With domestic public opinion increasingly recognizing that military interventions have yielded economic instability rather than security, the regime requires a narrative of decisive action. By framing financial restrictions in the sweeping language of wartime mobilization, the White House attempts to project control. However, replacing missile strikes with secondary financial boycotts does not erase 6 months of stalled objectives and reduced munitions. As global economic friction mounts and the Strait of Hormuz remains contested, maximum financial pressure may simply deepen the deadlock, leaving the US entangled in a multi-front, multinational conflict with no clear exit strategy. I'm Anthony Davis. You can find me on the 5 Minute News YouTube channel and podcast, on Wednesdays co-hosting Uncovered, on Global AF, on Legal AF, and on Sundays on The Weekend Show with Midas Touch.
这场持续近6个月的伊朗战争走到今天，最值得我们关注的已经不只是战场上的炮火与导弹，更是战争叙事本身正在发生的变化。起初，华盛顿不断强调军事打击已经重创伊朗，德黑兰的军力和国家机器都遭到严重削弱，甚至暗示胜利已经近在眼前。可是，当军事行动没有带来预期中的屈服，伊朗政府没有垮台，核计划没有被彻底消除，外交谈判也没有取得突破，美国政府突然把主要战线转向金融领域，并且将这场行动包装成一场规模空前的经济围剿。从表面上看，这是一套针对伊朗石油、航运、数字资产、黄金、技术和航空业的全面制裁体系。美国财政部门试图切断伊朗与全球经济之间的联系，同时向第三国、金融机构、企业和个人发出警告，要求他们停止与德黑兰往来，否则就可能被排除在美元体系之外。这样的政策确实能够制造压力，也可能在短时间内扰乱资金流动，提高交易成本，甚至打击一个国家的部分经济活动。但问题在于，制裁的声势越大，越容易暴露出另一个现实，那就是军事手段并没有实现最初承诺的目标。如果伊朗真的已经被打得支离破碎，如果德黑兰真的已经无法维持国家运转，那么为什么还需要发动一场覆盖全球的金融行动，甚至不惜威胁盟友和合作伙伴？这恰恰说明，所谓决定性的胜利或许更多存在于公开讲话和宣传口径之中，而不是存在于真实的战略结果里。战争最危险的地方往往不是某一次空袭，而是目标不断变化，却始终没有人愿意承认目标已经落空。最初说要摧毁军事能力，后来变成要迫使政权屈服，再后来又变成切断经济命脉。目标一次次被重新定义，行动一次次被重新包装，最后公众看到的可能不是一条清晰的战略路线，而是一场不断寻找新说法的政治表演。从美国国内的民调来看，公众对战争的支持正在下降，支持对伊朗动武的比例减少，连共和党选民中的支持度也出现下滑，而总统施政满意度同样跌到低位。对于即将到来的中期选举而言，这显然不是一个可以忽略的信号。当一场海外战争开始影响能源价格、运输成本、就业预期和普通家庭的生活时，民众关心的就不再是白宫口中的宏大战果，而是这场战争究竟带来了什么，又还要付出多少代价。因此，所谓经济孤立行动也可以被理解为一种面向国内的政治讯号，它需要让选民相信政府仍然掌握局势，仍然能够采取强硬行动，仍然能够把压力传递给敌人。但金融制裁的宣传效果并不等于战略效果，把导弹攻击换成金融限制，并不能抹去过去数月没有实现的军事目标，也不能自动解决伊朗的核问题，更不能保证德黑兰会按照华盛顿设定的条件签署协议。更值得警惕的是，单边制裁很难真正做到所谓零漏洞。伊朗并不是一个与世界完全隔绝的国家，它仍然拥有贸易伙伴、能源市场和区域联系。中国长期以来是伊朗重要的贸易伙伴，土耳其等区域国家也未必愿意立即按照美国的要求行动。美国可以利用美元体系和金融网络施加巨大影响，但影响力并不等于无限控制力。当越来越多国家开始寻找替代结算方式、替代运输渠道和替代合作网络时，制裁也可能反过来推动全球经济体系进一步分裂。这种分裂带来的后果不只由伊朗承担，石油出口受阻， 会影响国际能源价格，航运路线受到威胁，会推高保险、运输和供应链成本。金融机构担心被制裁，就会减少跨境交易，企业则可能被迫在商业利益与政治压力之间做出选择。最终，普通消费者、制造业、能源行业以及依赖国际贸易的国家，都可能为这场对抗承担代价。与此同时，伊朗的反应也说明，经济压力并不一定会自动带来政治让步。外部攻击有时会削弱一个政府，但也有可能促使内部权力进一步集中，让强硬派获得更多支持。伊朗在遭受西方打击后没有立即崩溃，反而加强了国家机器的控制，并把冲突延伸到海上、网络和区域安全层面。霍尔木兹海峡一旦持续成为争夺焦点，局势就不再只是美伊两国之间的较量，而可能牵动能源运输、地区盟友和全球市场。这也让美国面临一个无法回避的问题：如果军事手段没有解决问题，金融制裁也无法迅速迫使对方投降。下一步究竟是什么？是继续增加制裁范围，扩大对第三国的威胁，还是重新回到外交谈判？如果只有施压，没有明确的谈判出口，只有最后通牒，没有可以接受的妥协方案，那么制裁最终可能不再是通往和平的工具，而会变成维持对抗本身的机制。真正有效的国家战略不能只看讲话是否强硬，制裁名单是否庞大，或者媒体画面是否足够震撼。更重要的是，它是否能够实现最初设定的目标，是否能够控制风险，是否能够给出清晰的退出路径。没有退出方案的强硬，很容易变成被局势牵着走；没有外交配套的制裁，也很容易把对手推向更深的对抗。回头看这场战争，最深的启示或许是现代冲突早已不只是战场上的胜负较量，也是一场关于叙事、民意、经济和国际规则的长期竞争。政府可以宣布行动取得进展，却无法永远替代现实本身；可以把僵局描述成最后一击，也无法保证局势真的会按照宣传稿发展。真正决定一场战争走向的，往往是资源能否持续、联盟能否维系、社会能否承受，以及对手是否仍然拥有反击和周旋的空间。当金融武器被频繁使用，当制裁从敌对国家延伸到第三国和普通企业，世界也应该重新思考一个问题：如果任何国家都可以凭借自身金融优势把本国规则强加给全球，那么国际秩序究竟是在维护安全，还是在制造新的不稳定？而对于身处全球经济体系中的每一个人来说，我们也不能只听谁的口号更响亮，更要观察事实有没有改变，目标有没有实现，代价又由谁承担。这场冲突还没有真正结束，金融封锁、能源震荡、海上对峙和外交博弈仍在继续。未来是走向谈判还是进一步升级，取决于各方能否承认现实，停止把失败包装成胜利，也取决于各国是否愿意为解决问题保留沟通空间。对于这场战争以及美国新一轮经济施压行动，您怎么看？欢迎在评论区留下您的判断，也欢迎点赞订阅，持续观看更多精彩视频。